What I want for you with the series that we're doing this summer is to prepare you for times like that. Because all jokes aside, those times will come. They may come, tomorrow for you. You may already be living in the midst of it. They may come 10 years down the road. They may come when you have your own family and your own kids. I can think of situations in my own life where we've had moments like that. We've had seasons like that. And so that's why I'm really grateful for the teaching that y'all have had in your lives up to this point. I pray that would continue. Because I know growing up in a youth ministry, it was so much about, let's have as much fun as possible. Let's attract as many people as possible. And obviously we still try to have fun, but those things are not going to last you a lifetime. The games that we play are not going to sustain you through seasons where your sister is just in pain and torment and all you can do is hug her, right? So that's my hope for stuff like this. So Genesis chapter 3, tonight we've got pretty heavy topic to cover, and we've got a lot of stuff to go over. So we might go a little over time, but I think that'll be okay. If your parents are here at 7:30 and you have to go, completely understand. Don't feel bad about getting up and leaving. But just forewarning, we will go over a little over time because it's already 7:10. All right. So we have terms that sometimes we want to define, to use, to describe what's going on. But a lot of times those words fall short, right? So I could describe for you my favorite meal. Okay? And I've got a very vivid image of what my favorite meal is. It's a hamburger called the Argentinian from a place called Muscle and Burger Bar in Kentucky. All right? And the Argentinian is fantastic. All right? It's got a patty of beef. And then on top of that, it's got a patty of chorizo. Then it's got a thick slice of provolone cheese. And then it's got chimichurri sauce, which is kind of a green basil-based sauce with oil. And it's spicy. It's delicious. And then it's got caramelized onions on top of that and a toasted bun. And yeah, seriously. We may have to do this sometime. But the first time I took a bite into this hamburger, I'm not kidding. And I'm not a very emotional, evocative person, but I took a bite of this hamburger and I said, wow. I mean, I really did. And Katie just kind of looked at me because, I don't typically go, wow, when I take a bite of something. But it was the best hamburger I've ever had. And the fries that were with it, perfect crispiness, perfect amount of saltiness. And then they had this homemade ketchup that was just phenomenal. Now, I can use all the words to describe this hamburger. I can tell you how savory it was, how tender it was, how juicy it was. But here's the problem. None of you are currently tasting this hamburger right now.
Well, I can taste it.
So we can use our language to describe our experience, but that doesn't really translate well into other people. Maybe we have an idea of what's going on, but we really don't know the depths and the emotions that are involved with someone's experience. Well, I want to lay out clearly what we're going to do tonight, because the subjects that we're going to discuss are painful, they're difficult, and for some of you, they may be really close to home. Some of you may be in the midst of the pit, the depression, the darkness. Some of you may have come out of it. Some of you may have family members who are or have walked through it. And then for most of us, we will encounter this in some capacity at a point in our life. But we can talk about it all day long. We can describe what depression feels like. We can define it medically. We can use all these different terms. But until you feel it for yourself or you see someone you love walking through it, it's really hard to understand. And I've tried really hard over the past month or so, since I've known that I'm going to teach this. I've tried to talk to people who have walked through it. Because I'll just be honest, I've never walked through what I would describe as depression. I've experienced seasons of sadness, seasons of difficulty, but from what I've heard other people describe, I've never myself experienced this. And so even as people have described this to me in great detail, and maybe you've experienced this if you've walked through it, it's hard for other people to really identify what's going on. Okay? And I can even read accounts like so in this book, Depression. This is how the book starts off. It's technically called depression, but it can't be captured by a word. You feel numb, yet your head hurts. Empty, yet inside there are screams. Fatigue, yet fears abound. Things that were once pleasures now barely hold your attention. Your brain feels like it's in a fog. You feel weighted down. Do you remember when you had goals, things that you looked forward to? They could have been as small as going to a movie on Friday night or a job you wanted to accomplish. Now you have very few goals. Making it through the day seems like enough. But every day seems the same. There's no anticipation or satisfaction. There's no rest. Each day brings dreadful monotony, and you fear that tomorrow will be the same. Sleep, it's a mess. You can't get enough. You don't even remember what it feels like to wake up refreshed. But for some of you, as I read that, you think, yeah, that's what I've gone through. And for some of you, you think, that language doesn't sound anything like I've experienced. So, tonight, I don't want to spend too much time trying to define depression, okay? That's not what my goal is tonight. Because the important question is not to determine whether you're depressed or whether you can say, yeah, that's my experience. The more helpful question is, what am I doing in my life to fight or prepare for pain? Because pain and suffering is universal. Every human has pain and suffering. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why. And at some point, that pain is to a greater degree than at other points in your life. It prevents us from being able to perform what we would consider normal tasks of everyday life, or finding joy and satisfaction and accomplishment when we actually do complete those tasks. We see other people living their lives seemingly full of pleasure and joy, and our lives look the same, but then we don't feel the same. It robs us of the pleasure that we think we should be experiencing. So, rather, we're going to talk about ways in which we should expect pain as humans. And now, in our day and age, you may be tempted to say, all right, why do we need to look in the Bible to fight depression? Can I just go to a doctor? Can I just get medicine? Now, I want to be very clear about this. I am not a doctor, and so I can't tell you what medicine you should or should not take. However, what I know that's clearly revealed in the Scriptures is that we as humans were two parts. Okay? We have a physical and we have a spiritual. And both of those together create our whole being. We're not two separate. We're one whole made up of two parts. Okay? And so, therefore, when one is out of balance, it affects the other. So if our spiritual aspect, our soul, is out of whack, then that affects our physical. And the same way it goes the other way. If something's out of whack physically, well, that affects us spiritually. And so I can't fix your physical problems. Okay? So if you feel like you might be depressed because of a physical issue, go to your doctor. Have a physical done. Talk to them about what it looks like for you to care for yourself physically. What I want to do for you tonight is to prepare yourself to fight these things spiritually, which is just as, if not more important. Now, from the outset, before we really dive into this, I want to say this. Depression in and of itself is not a sin. Okay? It's not a sin just to feel sad or tired all the time, to exist in this state of darkness, of pain, to be in the pit, as many people described it. But how we respond to the pain or the anxiety or the depression that we're feeling, that's where sin, the action of sin, can enter the picture. So the Bible seems to expect suffering, pain, even depression to be a normal part of the human experience. In fact, there's a whole book written, what's called Lamentations. To lament is to extol upon, to talk about sorrow and grief and pain. I mean, just listen to this. Listen to the author of Lamentations and see if this doesn't describe what you've heard or felt in depression. Okay? Lamentations 2:11. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out to the ground. Okay? Chapter 3, verse 49. My eyes will flow without ceasing without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes cause me grief at the fate of my daughters of the city. 55. I called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. Chapter 4, verse 1. How the gold has grown dim. How the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of the streets. The precious stones of Zion, worth their weight in fine gold. How they are regarded as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hand. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives to them. I mean, just on and on and on. A whole book dedicated to just talking about grief and sorrow and pain. And so the Bible seems to assume that this will be a part of our experience. So how do we deal with that? And that's the question we're seeking to deal with tonight. So, Genesis chapter 3, verse 14. Now remember, we talked about last week how God made everything, He called it very good. But then we saw from chapter 1 to chapter 3, things go from very good to very bad very quickly. And so this is what God does in response to things going very bad. Verse 14. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. All right, so we talk about this pain, when we talk about depression, when we talk about being in the pit, there seems to be 5 causes. Okay? And the cause centers around sin. And then sin does these 5 things that introduces pain. Okay? So these 5 things. The first is there's pain brought about by an adversary, by an enemy. We see that in verse 15. Adam and Eve were not lied to by a sign on the tree, right? They didn't walk up to the tree and there was a sign there that said, hey, this is really good fruit, eat it. Okay? Cheap, free, delicious fruit, take a bite. That's not how they were tempted. What they were tempted by was a real being, a being that had a moral compass, that was able to speak to them and tell them, did God really say? And so immediately, when they come up, there's this enemy that exists and is lying to them, and they believe him. And so how did God respond? Well, he responds by first cursing the one who lied to him, the serpent, right? And what does he say? Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. So there's that curse. But then verse 15 talks about the struggle. I will put enmity, which basically means make you adversaries, make you enemies. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. So God is giving this warning to the serpent, but this also should be a warning to Eve and Adam. To hear that not only with me is there an adversary, but all of my children will have an adversary. And so this is still true today, that there is a real being called the devil that is fighting against God and his ways. And so therefore, when we who are made in God's image, who bear God's image, God intends for all of humanity to follow after him. Yet the adversary introduces lies. Did God really say? And even in the New Testament this is picked up. Ephesians chapter 6. Finally, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Okay? So there's this aspect in which Paul is telling his audience, you got to put on armor because you have a real enemy who has schemes to destroy you. In other places we see him described as a prowling lion. But what does it go on to say? For we do not struggle against flesh and blood, Other humans are not our enemy. Who's our enemy? But the rulers against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So we have real enemies, spiritual beings who bring lies into the world and try to convince us that God's ways are not best. And so pain is introduced by an adversary who lies to us. The second way that we see pain introduced to our experience is in relationships. Now, we talked about last week how there's 3 relationships which we exist in. Relationships with God, relationships with others, and relationships with the natural order. But now we see that the relationships between us and others is broken. And the one in which it's broken primarily begins with the family, right? So where does pain exist? Well, between the child and his mother. Okay? In pain you shall bring forth children. And your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Okay? So there's this problem that exists within the family unit. But this extends out to all humanity. I mean, we even see this in the next chapter, right? Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. What happens with the 2 sons of Eve? Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So immediately we see that pain is existing between these relationships that were meant to be good and life-giving as God intended, are now being manipulated and strained and brought to the point where pain and difficulty is in the mix. Words that we use to describe relationships are not joyful and life-giving as they're supposed to. Rather, we would use other words like hatred, jealousy, anger, envy, strife. Maybe someone's obsessive or controlling or oppressive. Maybe their difficulty or maybe the relationship is unsatisfying. See, these are the ways that we describe relationships because pain is introduced in that regard, because those relationships are broken. So in the human experience, we've already got, within just 2 verses, we've got the introduction of 2 types of relationships that bring pain in our lives. Number 3, the pain brought about by just nature. We see this one in verse 17. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. So now we have that creation is affected. So now creation is cursed. And the ways that we see this is that, well, Adam, who was supposed to cultivate and take dominion over the land, now the land is fighting against him. And what's the biggest way in Genesis that we see where nature is revolting? Well, it's the flood. Now we have water that's meant to bring life to plants. Now it's destroying all life on earth. And so pain is introduced just in our way we relate to the natural order around us. You know, it's not like skipping through the daisies like you see in the movie Sound of Music. How many of you have seen Sound of Music? Okay, way more than I was expecting. I'm so glad to hear that. But you know, there's that one scene where she's spinning in the meadow and there's all these flowers and it's just an idyllic scene. Well, how many of you have ever spun through the meadows and been like, man, this is gorgeous. There's no bugs. There's no mosquitoes. I'm not going to get sunburned. There's water aplenty everywhere. No one has that experience anymore. Oh, okay, perfect. Trinity, what's the name of the actress in Sound of Music? Oh, Julia Roberts? Andrews, not Julia Roberts. Julia Andrews. Okay. All right, so we got pain that's brought about by nature around us. And we see with Adam, too, that pain is also, number 4, pain is brought about by our work. Work was intended to be a source of fruit, a source of enjoyment. Adam was charged to have dominion, to work in the garden. And what does it say? Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. And so even his work is revolting against him. So there's pain brought about in the things that we do. The work that was supposed to be of our hands was always supposed to be a good thing. Now our work revolts against us. It's not easy to do the task at school. It's not easy to do your chores at home. It's not easy to hold down a job, any of those things. Those things are sources of pain in our life. And last, and maybe the most clear declaration that things aren't right, is that death reigns. Pain is brought about by death. Verse 19. He's going to do all these things till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return. See, this is the declaration that things aren't right. Death reigns. That's what Romans chapter 5 tells us. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because of sin, because all sinned. And in the next verse, we read that death reigns. It has dominion over our existence. Because every human who has ever lived has died. We all have this universal experience. And so pain at every level of the human experience is introduced. Right? Because all three of the relationships that we're supposed to have with God, with others, and with nature, all of them broken. And because they're broken, pain and suffering is our existence. Okay? And so, if this is external, okay, all of these are broken, what does that do about how our response is? Okay? And so this is where we start to get to the heart of the issue. All of these things are universal to us, so how do we fight against it? Well, we have to do some internal work and get to the root at the heart. Because our heart is really what determines our experience. Okay? Our heart is the center of our lives, if we're using biblical language. It drives the very things that we say, think, do, desires. And so this matters because we have to figure out what the heart is if we're going to figure out and address the problems at the core. Okay? Not just address symptoms. All right? I got a short video that illustrates this a little bit.
How to reset the check engine light in your car.
All right, does anybody need to take notes from that? Okay, if you go in your own car, now you know how to fix your check engine light. All right. So here's the thing. If we address symptoms, if we address things on the outside, are we really fixing the problem? Okay? You might have a cough, and you take cough syrup, and the coughing stops. But if that cough is a symptom of tuberculosis, you've really done yourself no good, right? Okay? If you've got a bruise, and you put makeup over the bruise so you can't see it anymore, but you don't address the internal bleeding that's causing the bruise, you're going to die. All right? In the same way, when we approach an idea like depression, if we just make ourselves feel better without addressing the real problem, we have done ourselves no good. In fact, we've done ourselves harm. Because we're hiding symptoms, but we're not addressing the root issue. That's why we've got to get to the heart. Okay? So if I'm depressed because of the relationships in my life, and I only just change the relationships in my life, that doesn't necessarily mean that my life is going to be any better, that the depression is going to go away. If I'm discontent with where I live, and then I move, that may make you feel better for a season, but that doesn't really address the heart. It addresses circumstances. If I take medication that removes the headache, but I don't actually address the heart, then I may feel better, but my root problem still exists. So we've got to get to the heart of the issue. So let's talk about the heart for a second. Let's see what the Bible talks about when it talks about the heart. Proverbs 4:23. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. All right? So from our heart flows the springs of life. Our life is centered on the heart. Matthew 12:34. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Remember how I said the heart is the center of the things we see, say, do, desire? These are biblical principles that come to fruition. Luke chapter 6, verse 45. The good person, out of the good treasure of his heart, produces good. And the evil person, out of the evil treasure, produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. See, the heart is the center of our lives, the driver of our behavior. But it's also our interpreter, okay? Now, if I were speaking to someone who speaks a different language, let's use a language like, Mandarin. All right? So someone comes here speaking Mandarin. And let's say I've got an interpreter that comes. There are two issues that could arise. Let's say one, I don't trust the interpreter. Okay? That makes it a problem because then I'm going to question everything that the interpreter tells me. I have no way of knowing what the person speaking Mandarin is saying. But if I don't trust the interpreter, then it doesn't do me any good. But there's maybe even a more dangerous situation. And I think this is getting a little closer to what our hearts are. Let's say I trust the interpreter, but the interpreter is bent on giving me things that are false. Okay? So I believe the things that interpreter says, but what the interpreter is telling me is not true. Well, the Bible paints our hearts in a similar situation. That our hearts are bent away from God and His ways. And so if the heart is the driver of our lives, what happens when we can't trust our heart? Our society tries to tell you, just follow your heart. But I'm here to tell you, the Bible tells us that's a very bad idea. Okay? Let's look at a few verses. Psalm chapter 5, verse 9. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self, their heart, is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. This is a verse Paul quotes in Romans to talk about how all men are sinful. Okay? Maybe even more clear, Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things. Notice there's no caveat here. Like, he doesn't say the heart is deceitful above all things except for, your enemies. The heart is deceitful above all things, except for Satan. No, Jeremiah just lays it flat out. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And then James chapter 1, 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one. That's a bold claim. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And then we see this chain of events that progresses. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And this is what's universal about the human experience. That our hearts all exist in this state, where it's bent away from God and His ways. We saw that really clearly in Romans. And this is what Blake talked about on Sunday morning. That we inherit sin nature from Adam. So our hearts are turned away from God apart from Jesus. And this is why we need Jesus to come and to not only just make our lives better, we need someone who comes in and changes our hearts from the inside. Okay? So with all that depressing news before you, let's talk about depression. Okay? So, let's say that you are not in the pit. Let's say that you've never experienced depression in your life. How do you think about this idea? How should you deal with it if you've never dealt with it? Okay? Well, the first thing I have to tell you is don't be surprised by it. As we've laid out and as we've shown from the Scriptures, this is a common human experience. This is something that's common for humanity. Whether it gets diagnosed by a doctor or not, your life is filled with pain and suffering. And I'm sure that you can think about your own week, this past week, and you can think about maybe small ways in which pain has entered your life, in which you have experienced suffering. Okay? Depression seems to be a long, extensive, almost seemingly endless season of that pain and suffering. Okay? So what should we do? Well, we shouldn't be surprised by it. We should prepare for it. And you can replace depression with any other kind of pain that's inevitable with that term. Prepare for it. Don't be surprised by it. Prepare well for pain and suffering because it will come. And one of the first things that we do here is we divorce what it means to believe that God is good when circumstances are good. Okay? So again, this is before we're in this period. So things are going relatively well. But here's the problem, and here's something that our culture tries to teach us just by the language that it uses. If things are going well, then that means God is good. Okay? So if I have strong friendships, God must be good. If I'm making good grades, God must be good. If I'm having lots of fun, God must be good. If I've got a good job, God must be good. But do you see what problem this creates? What happens when any of this falls out? What happens when the rug is pulled out from under us, when we don't have those strong friendships, when we don't make those good grades, when we're not having fun, when we're not enjoying life, when we're not getting along with our parents? The temptation to equate these means that when one drops out, then the other drops out. When we're not experiencing the good things in life, when we're not experiencing the best life, then we begin to doubt God's goodness. So we've got to divide those things. And we've got to make God's goodness independent of our experience. That whatever we're going through, God is still good. And we see this really clearly in Job. Okay? So those of you who know the story of Job, it's really similar to the story of the man who wrote the song It Is Well. Right? Satan goes and he visits God and he says, hey, have you considered Job? Let's see what happens if we take everything away from him. And so he takes all his stuff, takes all his family, takes all his status. And this is how Job responds to it. So he had the good life. He was rich beyond comparison. And this is how Job responds to his suffering. Job chapter 1, verse 20. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. And he said, naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. If anyone has a right to be depressed, it's Job, right? But what does Job do? He worships. Notice it says he did not sin. Now it's not saying he was perfect. What it says is the overall character of his life was one that trusted and believed God. He didn't charge God with wrong. Now, do you think this is just random? That Job just happened to be strong enough to be able to fight through this? No. Job had evidently prepared himself for this. He had not built his hope on the good experiences of his life, but he built his hope on the goodness of God. And so therefore, when the rug is pulled out from under him, he did not sin and did not charge God with wrong. He worshiped God. Now notice he's not happy. He's not sitting here jumping for joy, singing, I will not be more... What's the song? I'll think of it later. Okay, but think of it like this. When the light goes out, when the power goes off in your house, and it's at night, there's a couple things you try. You'll try to flip the switch a couple times. Nope, everything else is out, so it makes sense that this light switch doesn't work. Okay, then you go try to find the candle. You find the candle, but there's no matches. Then you go for the light or the flashlight. You dig through the drawer, you find the flashlight. Guess what? No batteries. All right, so you're still left in the dark because you're unprepared. Well, the same thing with depression. The pit is going to come. The darkness is going to envelop you. Unless we prepare for it, unless we get ready, then we're going to be scrambling in the dark for anything that we can grab onto. So we have to prepare well. So prepare yourself well now by dwelling on God's Word, specifically God's promises. And here's a great resource for this, and I plan to have a couple of these in 2 weeks when we come back. They're called Fighter Verses. Fighterverses.com if you want to write this down. Fighterverses.com. This is a resource that's got a list of the promises of God, verses that we can go through and we can memorize. And I know that sounds daunting. Hey, I'm not in school. It's summer. I don't want to have to memorize anything. I've memorized all the formulas I can for the year. Okay? This is one of those things that this is important for us. So Fighterverses.com, list of verses that are short, easy to memorize, but specifically dwell on God's goodness and God's promises. All right. So prepared ourselves well. What do we do when the lights go out? What do we do when we're enveloped in darkness? How do we respond? Well, here's the cycle that happens. Okay? When we're vulnerable, and then we've got this interpreter inside of us, an interpreter that's not always working for our good. In fact, the old man, if we're believing in Jesus, our old selves, still fighting against the new self. When lies are given, then we believe those lies. Such as, I feel like I'm a burden to my family. I feel like they'd be better off without me. And so you believe that. You're told this lies. You would be better off apart from your family. You would be better off, or they would be better off. And so you begin to believe those lies. And so that creates more emotions and creates more vulnerability. So we believe more lies, and it's this vicious cycle that we can't ever get out of. So how do we fight against this? Well, one, we feed on truth. because that starves out lies. Okay? Now that may seem natural, truth, lies, but this is something that we need to be told over and over and over again. We need to feed on truth to root out lies. Maybe it's read books that you wouldn't typically read, like Job or Lamentations or Ecclesiastes. These aren't books with striking narratives. They're stories that will carry us through, but what they do is they provide us with language that describes our experience. So Job, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, great books to read. The second thing that you should do is you should tell somebody. Okay? One of the lies that we believe in depression is that I'm unique in my experience, that it would be shameful to tell someone. That is just blatantly false. So if you feel like this is your experience, tell someone, and tell someone quickly. Tell someone that you trust. How much time? Going way over. All right, let's hit a few of these real quick. Third thing you should do. You should pray for delivery. Now, delivery may not come immediately. Okay? Job, if you read the book of Job, then at the end of the book, he's restored with a new family, with more riches than he had before, and his life takes a total 180. But that's not always the experience. I mean, Josh was talking about Hope earlier, and how she is still fighting this same disease, fighting this still same pain. And there's many of you who maybe are in the midst of pain and you see no way out. And there's a reality in which there may not be any relief to your life. But pray for delivery. Because one thing that we do have promised is that these things are not ultimate. They won't last forever. Lastly, pray for purpose. Okay? We don't understand the why always. Why is this happening to me? But what we can pray is that God would create purpose out of it. God, use the pain and suffering, even if it's not alleviated, even if I have to exist this way for the rest of my life. God, use this for your glory. I mean, that's one of the things that we talked about in Romans chapter 8, a great chapter on suffering. Okay? If you're in the pain, if you're in the pit, or someone you know is in the pit, Romans chapter 8, great passage to read. But this is one of the promises that it gives us. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. All right. So what are some other responses to depression? Okay. So 2 responses that some people elect to pursue in response to depression are self-harm and suicide. We're going to talk about these really quickly, but my hope is rather that if either of these describes you, that you will seek someone to talk to immediately. Okay? And I promise you that if you find a leader in this room, if you find me, if you call your parents and you tell them, I don't expect you to find someone that's going to be angry, that's going to throw it back in your face, that's going to say, how could you? You're going to find someone that loves you and cares for you. Okay? So if either of these describes you, or these are thoughts in your brain about participating in, find someone to talk to immediately. Okay? So self-harm. Self-harm is a coping mechanism that people use to deal with extreme emotions or with pain. It's any attempt to cause bodily harm, to evoke emotions, or any kind of personal reaction. Okay? But again, this describes what self-harm is, but it doesn't really get to the root of it. Okay? It doesn't really get to the reasons why people do it. Here's one quote of a person who was participating in self-harm. When I was harming myself, I didn't see it as a problem, but as a crutch. Without it, I couldn't walk. Take it away, and I'd stumble and fall. I didn't choose self-harm like you'd pick a scarf or a book. In fact, I felt ashamed of it. But it was the only thing that I found to help me manage my pain. When I was feeling too much, it numbed me. When I was numb, it helped me feel. I didn't see it as a problem, but as a solution to many other problems, far darker and far larger than I can cope with. So here's the problem. Self-harm offers promises that are lies, that can't fit the bill that they proclaim to do. And so if this is you, there's 2 truths that you need to dwell on. First is the body of Jesus, okay? Like we established, the greatest problem we face is not primarily our relationships with each other, our status in this world, or anything like that. Our greatest problem is our relationship with God because of sin. But the ironic thing is that scars, cuts, and pain are the solution to that problem, but they're not our own. See, the way that problem is solved is by the scars and cuts and pains that Jesus went through. So when we're tempted to self-harm, we've got to drive ourselves to the cross and see that any of the shame, any of the pain, any of the numbness that I feel, Jesus died to redeem. And so I don't have to put myself through anything because Jesus has already accomplished the very thing that I need. So we dwell on Jesus' body on the cross. And the second thing we consider is our own, that we're created in God's image. Now that means, like I said earlier, that our bodies matter. Our physical well-being is significant. Now, and rightly so, people will point out that because God created your body, therefore to intentionally harm it would be sinful. But the other aspect would be that you, all of you, and I don't mean the collective you, I mean all of you personally, your body and your soul are created with dignity. And so we treat it as God intended for us to treat it. That means, even if that you have intentionally tried to harm your body in the past, maybe you've participated in self-mutilation or self-harm, or that you've degraded your own body, I want to remind you tonight that even if those things have happened in your past, that you, all of you, body and spirit, are still full of dignity and worthy of honor because you were created in the image of God. There's nothing that can remove that reality from you. Okay? There's no point at which you reach in which you're no longer in God's image. We don't move beyond that. And so you are worth dignity. You are worth honor because you were created in the image of God. Okay? Last thing we'll talk about is suicide. And again, there's so much more that could be said about these topics. My hope is that if any of this is a thought in your brain, that you will go talk to someone even tonight. Okay? Suicide is the conclusion that things would be better off for you and for those around you if you're no longer alive. Suicide and self-harm are not the same, but they can be related. What suicide boils down to is hopelessness. Now this, of course, is an oversimplification. There's so much more to it than this. But hopelessness is an utter certainty that there's no other solution to your problem. This belief could be years in the making, could be brought about by a traumatic event. And you know what? There's a reality in which we can look at our situation and we can see hopelessness. But again, that's another lie that we're led to believe. Because there is hope. Not because your life can get better. That's not where we get hope from. Not because you're so smart and that your life can accomplish so many things. Those are good things, but those things don't provide lasting hope. Okay? Lasting hope comes with the fact that Jesus has solved our greatest problem. You're going to be tired of how many times I'm going to mention the gospel over the next few weeks. Because it is the only thing that can address these issues. Everything else is temporal. Everything else won't last. Something may last you 10 or 15 years and say, oh God, you've created me for a purpose, so that gives me the hopes to stay alive. But what if you don't see that purpose come to fruition? True hope comes when we believe God's word specifically in what it says about what Jesus has accomplished. So, if you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, you may say, well, I'm not trusting in Jesus, so I don't have hope. But there is hope for you because you can trust in Jesus today. See, Jesus has addressed this very idea of hopelessness by introducing light into a dark place. I mean, John chapter 1 talks about Jesus being light. And hopelessness is described as being in complete darkness. So even in the imagery that the Bible uses, Jesus is the very thing needed to address our issues. And if anything tonight that I've described to you goes over your head or you forget it, the last thing that I want you to hear is that regardless your circumstance, now or in the future, there is hope. Hope that your troubles are not eternal. Hope that in Jesus you have a friend in times of difficulty. Hope that in Jesus He connects you with a Father that will never abandon you. Hope that you have a friend who understands pain, who understands suffering because He went through it Himself. See, Jesus was described as a man of sorrow, a man of grief. And so Jesus knows. So don't lose hope. Dive into God's Word. Find someone to talk to your parents, to a leader, to a trusted friend. Because we want to walk this life together. Through all of its pain, through all of its suffering, we want to walk through this together. I want to read parts of Psalm 42, and then we'll close. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night. While they say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember. As I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them into the procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Let's pray.